Welcome. This is Najma Minhas with Global Village Space. Today we're looking at the state of US-Saudi Arabia relations, President Biden's recent trip to Saudi Arabia and what this means, and why so many people in the United States are unhappy with his meeting Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. I'm joined today by Professor Gregory Gause, who is the Professor of International Relations and Head of the International Relations Department at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Professor, thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
Professor, I'd like to start with a little bit of a superficial element to the trip, and that is the fist bump that President Bush did with MBS. A lot of people have taken that negatively. How do you view it? Do you view it as being symbolic? Do you view it as being a faux pas, or really media hype about nothing in particular?
I think it was media hype about nothing in particular. I think that that it was supposedly a COVID precaution, but I think Biden probably shook some hands in Israel, and I don't know, but I think it was originally supposed to be a COVID precaution.
Do you think President Biden going to Saudi Arabia, though, has almost mean that he's conceded to MBS? Initially, he's talked about it being a pariah state. So how do you view his trip going out to Saudi Arabia in the first place?
It's certainly a climb down from his position in the election campaign and in the early months of the administration, where he wouldn't directly deal with MBS. So I think that it's not just the Ukraine war, but also the rise in oil prices, obviously affected by the Ukraine war, but not completely related to it. And I think that the looming crisis with Iran, because I don't think that the two sides will be able to return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the limitation on Iran's nuclear programs. I think all those things basically drove the administration and the president to say, we have to get back to having a more normal relationship with Saudi Arabia.
What were the U.S. objectives that did he state any, do you think, clearly with his team or maybe amongst the American population? What were the objectives for him going?
Well, I think oil was certainly a part of it, but I think it would be a mistake to judge the trip the way many people in the American media are. The Saudis aren't increasing their oil production enough, and thus it was a failure. I do think that Biden wanted to have a better understanding with the Saudis about their role in the world oil market at this time of disruption because of the Ukraine war and hopefully the end of COVID and increased demand. And I think that he probably has gotten the Saudis to a position where they're more willing to play the role that they have played in the past to try to prevent prices from going too high, although the Saudis obviously they like higher prices after years of relatively low price during COVID. Right. So I think that there was some movement on that, and we can see oil prices coming down. The Saudis have increased production over the last few months, maybe not as much as some people in the US would like, but they have done that. So that was part of it. But I think it was also the overall tenor of the relationship, which had gotten very nasty. And given the fact that, as I said, it's not just the Ukraine situation, which thrust the Saudis as the world's largest exporter of oil back into center stage, but also what I think will be a very tense time vis-a-vis the Iranian nuclear issue. And the administration also had this desire to try to build on the Trump administration's Abrahamic Accords by trying to bring the Saudis and the Israelis closer together.
Okay, but some of those, they got nowhere, right? We heard nothing on the Israeli issue. I mean, a lot of people were talking about the fact that there would be something. And even on Iran, I mean, do you think any kind of agreement, they would have come to any kind of agreement on Iran?
I don't know about an agreement, but maybe a better understanding of what's coming down the pike. On the Israel issue, the Saudis aren't going to take a high-profile change of stance on Israel while the king is still alive. The king is from an older generation, and he's very committed to the Palestinian cause. I think MBS is much more willing to deal with the Israelis, and we've had past signals of that. But as long as the king, King Salman, is still alive, we're not going to see a major public shift in the Saudi policy toward Israel. It's very clear that there's all sorts of things going on behind the scenes between the Saudis and the Israelis.
Do you see Biden as actually having a vision for the region, though? I mean, we know that Obama had a clear vision where He then signed the JCPOA with Iran. We had Trump pushing back and showing maximum pressure on Iran. Do you feel that Biden has any kind of vision for the region? Because right until this point, it seemed as if he was not even interested in the region.
I think all three of the last recent presidents campaigned on de-emphasizing the American commitment to the Middle East after 20 years of intense American involvement post 9/11. What each of them has found is that they can't really ignore the Middle East, right? You might, the old joke is you might not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you.
Right.
And so Obama and Trump both couldn't avoid direct involvement in the region, and I think that we're seeing that in the Biden administration as well.
You said that every last three presidents have all campaigned on having a less relationship or movement away from the Middle East.
Yes.
Why is that? I mean, was it all about men on the ground? Because the United States before that had a relationship, a very strong relationship with the Middle East, and it didn't actually involve men on the ground. The men on the ground only started in 1990.
So yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. And in fact, it wasn't 1990 or 91 that's the turning point, because most Americans saw that as an extremely successful use of military force. It was really the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War and how long they dragged on, right, and the inability of the United States to achieve what were incredibly ambitious goals, basically remaking the domestic politics of those two places, and they failed. And I think that the weariness in the American public with the military commitment in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the rise of Chinese power and the obstreperousness of Mr. Putin even before the Ukraine war, led certainly the last three administrations to say that we have to refocus. The term in the Obama administration was the pivot to Asia, right? And that was the same when the Trump administration, their national security documents all talked about the return of great power competition. And that's certainly the way the Biden people were talking coming in, as China being the competition with China being the central element of American foreign policy. But the Middle East is inescapable, both as an energy source and as an area that can generate problems that draw you back in. And thus, it was I think it was always a dream to think that an American president could maintain a global strategy without a significant Middle East element to that.
Do you think the fact that the Middle East has also seen China and Russia very much engaged in that region the past couple of years? I mean, Russia in Syria and China in general, especially with Saudi Arabia as well, is one of the reasons why the United States now maybe feels that we need to get re-engaged again with the Middle East and have a policy on that?
I think that that's true, but I think Russia and China have very different kinds of engagement in the region. Right? Russia is a producer of oil, and thus it has both conflicting and at times cooperative incentives with oil producers like Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi-Russian relationship has been fascinating in the oil area. China is a consumer of energy. And what it wants is basically a stable Middle East from which it can purchase energy. It doesn't want to pick sides between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It wants to buy energy from both. Russia is much more, I think, it's both much less reliant on the Middle East, but also more interested in the kind of military influence that it has in Syria. Kind of a hangover of the Soviet Empire and maybe even the Russian Empire. The Chinese, it seems to me, don't have those kinds of geopolitical ambitions, at least not yet. What they would like to see is a stable Middle East where they don't have to pick sides and they can buy energy from everyone.
But do you think the fact that we do have this multipolarity happening in the world increasingly, we're seeing that the era of the hyperpower of the United States is over. So will that influence how other countries also perceive the role that the United States can play? I mean, for example, will the Middle East perceive the role of the United States differently because we now once again have gone back to this multipolarity?
Oh, yes. And I think that was inevitable. That period from, say, 1990 through the 2000s, post 9/11, that 20-year period really was unusual in world politics. And it was inevitable and natural that great power competition would come back. But I think that it's important to recall that neither China nor Russia can match American assets in the region. And while it's absolutely true that countries in the region want to have a good relationship with Russia, they want to have a good relationship with China, right? Particularly countries that see the United States as hostile, like Iran. They have no other great power support. But even the countries that have good relations with the United States, including Israel, want to have good relations with China and Russia. So I think the countries in the region don't want to have to choose. To the extent that the United States might make them choose between Washington and Beijing, that would place these countries in a very uncomfortable position.
So it means we're going back to the basics, right? So what were the basics for this relationship, a strong relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia? I mean, they recognized each other in 1933, I think it was. And 1951, they signed a defense agreement, which is seen as a key moment in that relationship. What do you feel are what is the key to this relationship, and will it continue?
So oil has always been the key element, but I think a lot of people misunderstand the nature of the relationship, right? A lot of people think that there's this deal where the Saudis sell the United States oil and the United States protects Saudi Arabia. In fact, the United States historically has bought very little oil from Saudi Arabia. And it has been American companies, obviously, that developed the oil industry in Saudi Arabia, but they're all nationalized now. The Saudi oil industry is a Saudi company, not American companies. There was shared geopolitical interest during the Cold War. The Saudis, for all sorts of reasons, didn't like the Soviet Union, not just ideological, but the fact that the Soviets were backing the Saudis' rivals in the Arab world, like the Nasserist regime in Egypt. And with the collapse of the Cold War, with America emerging as the unipolar power, the Saudis enjoyed American protection in the Gulf War, which really was, I think, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, those were the signals of American unipolarity.
Right.
And so I do think that the Saudis enjoyed this strong strategic relationship with the United States. And the reason the United States cared about Saudi Arabia was, of course, geopolitics and the role that Saudi Arabia plays in Islam. But oil underlay the entire relationship. And without it, we wouldn't have the kind of American interest in the Persian Gulf region or in Saudi Arabia itself. Then 9/11, of course, brought counterterrorism into the mix. And from 9/11, really up till now, the counterterrorism cooperation with Saudi Arabia has become a real pillar of the relationship, as the Salafi jihadist movement has attacked the United States, and the United States has attacked it, most recently just a few days ago with the attack on Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul. And the Saudi regime, although it had a role in encouraging the Salafi movement over decades, the Salafi jihadists have been attacking Saudi Arabia as well. Right. So in that sense, it's still a strategic understanding, but instead of a Cold War context, it's the war on terror context. So oil has always been the underlying element, but there have also been these other strategic interests that bring the two countries together.
So one of a question I wanted to ask you, going back to the Israeli angle to this, the fact that a lot of people were talking about Saudi Arabia maybe potentially getting in a stronger relationship with Israel, and Abrahamic Accords, which are being signed by the UAE, Bahrain, and some of the other countries. Do you see Saudi Arabia under MBS? You mentioned that we probably won't see it under the king, but under MBS, do you think this makes MBS more palatable, therefore, to the Americans?
I think that might be one incentive for him to think about these things. I mean, I do think that in many ways the Emiratis signing the Abraham Accords was an effort to cement their relations with the United States at a very delicate time, because many people in the Democratic Party saw the Emirates and Saudi Arabia as being very close to Trump. And if Trump had won a second term, it would have been fine with them, probably with the Emiratis and the Saudis. But with the Democratic administration coming in, I think the Emiratis realized that the best lobbyist that they could have in Washington was a friendly Israel. And so I do think that there was something to that in terms of the driver for the Abraham Accords. But I also think that for Saudi Arabia, unlike the Emirates, the Saudis have a real public opinion, right? The Emirates are a very small country with a very, very small citizen population,
Right.
and fabulously wealthy. They really don't have any serious internal public opinion issues. The Saudis do. And I think that they're going to be more cautious in the way they deal with Israel, because dealing with Israel doesn't bring them immediate benefits. They have enough leverage themselves to maintain their relationship with the United States. And I think that in that sense, the geopolitics pushes the Israelis and the Saudis together on the Iran question. But domestic politics makes the Saudis a little more cautious than, say, the Bahrainis or the Emiratis or the Moroccans are on this issue.
It's interesting you mentioned the domestic opinion, because it's clear that on the Arab street, they're still not in favor of recognizing Israel due to the Palestine-Israel issue. And the fact that some of the regimes, the rulers in the UAE and the other smaller countries like Bahrain have accepted Israel under the Abrahamic Accord will not necessarily go well with the street power. Do you think, therefore, the US should be encouraging it the way it was done under Trump? Because what is the point of encouraging something which will then see a backlash and may create safety issues both for the United States and for those rulers in those countries?
Yeah, I never thought that pushing the Abraham Accords was a great idea. But I have to admit that I've been surprised at how little backlash there's been. And I do think that we have to be open to the idea that with generational change in the Middle East, the salience of the Palestinian issue has gone down. Now, that doesn't mean that if you ask Arabs in a public opinion poll, do you think the Palestinians should have a state? Overwhelmingly, they would say that. You know, if you had to choose between the Palestinians and the Israelis, overwhelmingly, they would side with the Palestinians. But it's the salience of the issue. How important is it? And we know, you know, historically, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, it was an incredibly important mobilizing issue for vast swaths of public opinion in the Arab world. Now, one of the interesting things that's happened recently is that the big champion of the Palestinian cause has become a non-Arab country, Iran. And it's interesting to note that I think in Iranian public opinion, you don't see that same sympathy toward the Palestinians because they don't have that common Arab background.
Right.
And so you have an ideologically driven government in Tehran, right, that is very much into confronting the Israelis, right, at least rhetorically supporting the Palestinians. And you have Arab governments that I think are more pragmatic, that are inching toward, or in some cases running toward, better relations with Israel. And I think that some of that's geopolitics, some of it's economics. I think that for the Emirates, the matchup of Israeli technology and Emirati capital is seen as something that can benefit both sides. And so I think that there are interesting changes going on that whole Israel question in both the Arab world and in the broader Middle East.
Where do you see the future of US-Saudi relations going? And what are the key things that they need to focus on to strengthen these relations?
So I think that one of the things that both sides have to recognize is this is never going to be a relationship that has a strong public opinion support, particularly on the American side. But I also think that it has been run at the elite level for decades and run pretty successfully.
Foreign policy elite?
Yes.
Right. In the United States, right?
In the United States, yes. And in Saudi Arabia, for that matter. And thus, I think the key is to keep the issue out of public opinion. And for that to happen, the Saudis have to do things that I think are in their long-term interests anyway. They have to continue to play a moderating role in the world oil market.
Right.
They have to avoid the kinds of reckless actions that MBS took at the beginning of his rise to power.
Right.
You know, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi being the thing that mobilized elite opinion in the United States the most. But I think that one hopes that MBS has learned something. I think he came into office very inexperienced in terms of foreign policy and with a belief that Saudi Arabia was a superpower, that it could act like Russia, it could act like China, you know, countries that kill their dissidents abroad or try to, that it could act like Iran, right, which also tries to kill its dissidents abroad. But I think that MBS hadn't inculcated the lessons that his father and his uncles had over the decades about the limits on Saudi power. And one of those limits is you want to maintain a good relationship with the United States, so don't do anything that would unnecessarily disrupt that.
Right. Yeah. Professor Gause, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure.